It's a real privilege to be here, and thank you very much for the committee to the committee for inviting me. As Patrick introduced, I work for Mercer. It's a company you may not be familiar with. It's a consulting firm, and our work is with people. We influence and make a difference to 110 million people's lives every day, working in the field of health, wealth, and careers, predominantly with employers. I've spent over 30 years working in this field, living and working out in the Middle East, internationally, and back in Europe as well. I'm also the co-chair of the UK Business Strategy Group, looking at the specific issue of ageing populations, and that's one of the focuses of part of the content of my influences today. So welcome very much to the Future of Health panel discussion. And during the next 75 minutes, we'll be covering most of the health issues and many of the issues to be addressed by 2050 in both the developed and the developing worlds, and looking at potential solutions that biotechnology may be able to offer. Our aim for this panel discussion is to get a snapshot of the biggest trends, gaps, and challenges in the health sector, and examine potential solutions that are already in development and some of those that will still be in aspirational or idea stage. My attention will also focus in very much on workplace health for the reasons I've just outlined in terms of my own background. And why is this so relevant now, particularly? Well, we are all living longer. Roche say so. And for mainly financial reasons, we will have to finance that longer life after all. We're likely to be working longer too. 10 to 15 years more working longer in my own research. So I'm keen to understand the panel's perspectives on what conditions you expect to manifest in an older age working population, and hear the social or other perspective, and hear the health sector's view on whether or not it's from an economic, social, or other perspective that developments are prioritised. Employers, after all, could be a great distribution channel for many of your future aspirations and ideas, and certainly a great place to look for funding. I found some of Matthew's comments in the earlier panel on the funding gap particularly relevant in terms of commercialising ideas. And certainly from an employer's perspective, when I go through some of the statistics I have for you this afternoon, you'll see the very economic reasons why they could be potential great sources of funding for you. So by 2050, it's anticipated that almost a quarter of the world's population will be aged over 60. That's almost 3 times as many as in the 20th century. This equates to around 2.5 billion people. And a great majority of those people will still be at work to fund that longer life. And just to quantify the typical costs involved in sickness and absence costs for that population, just an example from the UK, over 131 million days each year are lost through sickness absence alone. The economic costs to business are therefore already immense, and they are looking for ways to improve that sickness and absence record. As the population ages and more chronic conditions set in, this economic cost is likely to increase significantly. Those 131 million days already cost British business £16 billion per annum. I'm keen to understand how health professionals will proactively consider the economic implications of disease in future. And just to repeat, employers could be a great distribution channel for your new products and services. The distinguished panel with me today are experts in their own field, and I will be delighted to introduce them to you in a moment. But first, I'd just like to share a few highlights from a major piece of workplace research on workplace health that Mercer ran last year. These results are taken from the Britain's Healthiest Company study. This year it will actually be renamed the Britain's Healthiest Workplace study, and it's run in conjunction with a number of major partners in the insurance and healthcare fields. Healthy employees are able to deliver 30 productive working days more per annum than unhealthy employees. And if they get good sleep, you can add another 5 working days of productivity per annum to that total. Over 87%, of the 30,000 employees in that study last year had a lifestyle that potentially shortened their lives. The average shorter life gap between participants' vitality age, we call it the vitality age, it's a physiological measure of how lifestyle affects long-term health, and their actual age was 3 years and 10 months. It becomes progressively larger with higher age. The shorter life gap for men was far larger than for women, by around 30%. The shorter life gap for those on lower incomes was almost double. And the key chronic conditions that employees are facing at the moment and employers are having to deal with through that study were deemed to be allergies, asthma, lower back or neck pain, high blood pressure. They're the examples of the most prevalent chronic conditions experienced by almost 30% of that sample. So, having set the economic context for the discussion on future health, I'd like to introduce our panel to you. And I'm going to try and get them in the right order because until today I haven't met these panelists myself. So first of all, on my left we have Dr. Li Chen, who's the President and CEO of Hua Medicine. He's involved in China's drug discovery strategy and the merits of utilising a collaborative innovation model. He's also looking at the challenges posed by lifestyle diseases such as diabetes. So, Dr. Chen, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Li Chen, CEO of Hua Medicine. I just thinking what I should say about Hua Medicine and then why I'm here. First of all, I was at Roche R&D Center in US and then after working there for the mic is not on? No? Yeah. I saw his shaking his head. It says on here. Hello? You're on? Okay. Well, that. That's because of the jet lag I had. So I was, during the weekend, I was in the conference of our clinical trial KOLs and physicians. And then we have the diabetes drug now in the phase 2 trial. It's the first in class anti-diabetics. And then now we're having our physicians talking about their experience for the first time. They are doing and developing their first in class drug with the novel mechanism, normal chemical entity, and the first time enter into China patients, and then conducting this trial. Well, you say, oh, what's so new, right? We've been doing this for years. Well, that's new in China. 10 years ago, back to 2004, when I was appointed as the head of Roche R&D Center in China, I went back to China and I talked to a lot of industry leaders, and then people telling me they're doing R&Ds. And their R&D, by all means, are just developing the new chemical process, enable us to make the generic drugs. I can tell you now, right, over the last 10 years, with a lot of efforts from the government, from the multinationals, from the investor community, the new molecule with what we call the new chemical entity enter into clinical trial, into the register. There's over 100 of them. So that's where I think there's a larger, major change. in discovering and developing novel medicine. And then there's a major understanding about the different diseases, different patient needs that we need to address. So Hua Medicine is among the first few companies really be able to identify the difference between the genetics, lifestyle, and then disease progression between the type 2 diabetes. And then we are, through the clinical study and working with our physicians and then medical community to identify the special biomarkers that allow us to differentiate the type of type 2 diabetes and then give them the medicine we're developing. And then the recent phase 2A trial has shown that the target effective rate is greater than 80% on the patients treated using our drug. And then also the type of development is also now conducted in the US through a different type of profiling mechanism, and then allows to target US diabetics. And then again, give a very good response rate. A lot of people have been talking about personalized medicines. A lot of people talking about innovations and through genetics and so on. And then Roche been, over the years, been the champion in the personalized medicine. And then yet, the personalized medicine concept has been localized somehow toward oncology area. And I can tell you, all the chronic diseases is going to have its personalized medicines aspect. It's all come from the genetics, lifestyle, and the environment. Diabetes is one of them. And Hua Medicine is continuing in the diabetes area and also moving to the metabolic syndrome, which include dyslipidemia, high blood pressure, and also the blood sugar regulation. And then understanding underlying mechanism and the pathology of the disease, and then really understand what your patients need. It's give us, where we are going to go. And then go back to what I just said. I have 80 physicians and then KOLs come to this weekend meeting. And then the purpose is not just tell me that the trial's doing well, the response rate is good, the risk factors relatively low. It's more telling me how they actually involve the patients, involve the trial, and then make it patients actively participating and then taking the care, their health into their own hand. And this is what I try to say that in the chronic disease treatment, it's not just regulatory can do us, or do we have the funding to get things done. It's whether you will be able to foster the close relationship, interaction between the physicians and then the patients, and then we collectively form one community that tackle this chronic disease together. I think that's what I try to say today, and then also it's a great pleasure to be here, and then thank for the GapSummit. As far as I remember, they told me that I'm the first Asian company being invited here, and then pleasure to be here, and hopefully I can interact with you and learn more about our biotech innovation from London, Cambridge. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. And next we have Dr. David Williams, who is the CEO of Discuva. Dr. Williams is involved in the drug discovery process, including the way clinical trials are set up. He's also involved with drug pricing and reimbursement. So if I can hand over to you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you very much. So yes, I'm CEO of Discuva and Bactivo as well, another company in Cambridge. So I've got 7 minutes to overview how you get a drug to a patient. So that's how you discover it, how you prove it works, and how you actually get it to the patient in terms of pricing. So The works of Shakespeare would be easier. So let's start with the first part. So, well, the whole part takes a lot of money, and it has to make a profit. So figures out there sort of claim anything from $1 billion to $11 billion just to get a drug to a patient. So first part of the process is discovering the drug chemical entity. And that's something, as Jeremy's previously said in the last talk, has been spectacularly successful at certain types of disease. And viral disease is one very good example where we've essentially made HIV asymptomatic. So AIDS has sort of gone away in most parts of the world, and HCV has a cure. That's amazing. That's been done in the last 30 years. But where there isn't a single causative molecular function of that you understand of a disease, we've been pretty unsuccessful. And complex diseases such as cancer and autoimmune disease have been appallingly unsuccessful, actually. And there's only a handful of cancer treatments that actually have been useful from the last 20 or 30 years of discovery. Patients are still dying. So there's a lot of work to do there. And as Craig Venter published last week, the minimal number of genes that are needed to sustain a bacteria, something like 400, 200 of them, we don't know what they do. So there's an enormous amount of biology to be discovered. There's a huge amount of chemistry to be discovered. For example, 95% of the cancer targets that we know about can't be addressed by conventional chemistry. So we need an enormous amount of chemistry as well. So that's drug discovery, pluses and minuses, but a lot of pluses. How you actually find out whether a drug works? Well, I mean, we diverged from our sort of primate cousins many years ago and went off to different corners of the world and evolved to separate environments and then came back together again. So basically everyone's different. And that's what you need to be able to assess in a clinical trial, whether your drug will work in a patient population that is pretty diverse. So you have sort of 3 stages of that process. You have the first process, which is stage 1, which is put the drug into a patient and see whether or not the patient keels over. Does it kill the patient? Hopefully not, because you've done animal toxicity studies beforehand. And that phase 1 study allows you to sort of increase your dose and find out the ideal dose to use in the next phase of research, which is a phase 2. Phase 2 study is, does it work? Is there efficacy? So you're pushing up the dose and you're seeing whether or not your patient gets better or not. Phase 3 is multi-center, loads of patients, different parts of the world, seeing if they all get better. Statistical significance on a big scale. Unfortunately, there's an enormous drive to be profitable in drug discovery. And if you look, I did a table, and I haven't got slides here, but I did a table of all of the targeted oncology treatments that have been marketed over the last 20 years, and a table in terms of survival benefit. And it goes from no survival benefit at all to 13 months survival benefit. So that's the statistical result of the clinical trial. What comes out at the end of it? Does the patient get better or not? Well, actually, a lot of these treatments don't really work very well. And that's a dirty little secret. And so we need to get better at that. But the bad thing about clinical trials is they cost a lot of money. So we've got to make that cheaper, because there's an enormous driver in a clinical trial to make sure you have success, because it's so expensive. Figures I've heard and figures I've used, £100,000 per patient it can cost to do a clinical trial. So when you're looking at a clinical trial of thousands of patients, that's an enormous amount of money you've got to put into a trial. So you've achieved a clinical trial success, and this is overviewed by the regulatory authorities that make sure you do everything correctly, all the regulatory procedures are followed, otherwise you go to jail. And you've got a drug that works or shows significance. Now you've got to get it to patients. So you've got to convince someone in some part of the world, or every part of the world, to actually prescribe your drug and put it on their list as something that will give a benefit. And that's where we talk about reimbursement. So, for example, in the UK, we have the National Centre for Care and Excellence, which is nice, which actually looks at the whether or not there's a benefit to actually treating the patient with a drug, and what is the cost of that benefit. And if you can show a benefit in that drug in terms of there's an economic benefit, then it's likely that it could get prescribed. But it's not actually given. And there's another part of the process that we go through in the drugs industry, which is essentially a bun fight, where you continually get on the phone to the NHS account manager and say, please prescribe my drug. So it's not a very well put together process yet. And the same goes on all over the world. And you've got insurance company providers in the US, for example, all have to be convinced. And so you've got these separate discussions going on all around the world to convince someone to prescribe your medicine, which you've shown a benefit for. So it is a very complex pathway to get a drug to market and get the costs that you need back on it. I think it's interesting looking at some of the newer models that are being used for drug reimbursement. For example, J&J, for example, licensed a drug from Millennium called Velcade, which is a multiple myeloma treatment, which gives 13 months survival benefit on average. But they're actually so confident because of that benefit to survival that they say, well, okay, in Europe, if you don't get a survival benefit, therefore you can have it free, so the patient doesn't pay. So there are these more inventive models for getting money back based on whether or not the drug works. And I would actually encourage more of these models to be adopted, because then it'll actually make the pharmaceutical industry more honest. I mean, I know a lot of people with different sorts of arthritis that have been on some of the anti-TNF therapies with absolutely no benefit at all. So I think we've got to be honest with ourselves in terms of whether a drug works or not, and not just rely on marginal statistics. I'm going to finish there.
Thanks very much, Dr. Williams. And our next panellist today is Professor Gerard Yvonne. He's the head of Department of Biochemistry here at Cambridge. His work is involved heavily in cancer research, and we'll hear from him today on an academic perspective. He is part of the advisory board for the GapSummit.
Well, thank you. It's always nice to be here. And of course, it's no coincidence that we're in Cambridge, or we might be in London, we might be in Oxford, we might be in Sheffield, we might be in Berkeley, we might be in San Francisco. These are all places with strong academic centers. And the truth is that no matter how good an industry we have for making drugs, the engine that drives it, of course, is discovery. And discovery is done by drug companies, biotech companies, but is also often done in a perhaps too little acknowledged way by people who have no idea what they're doing. They're sleepwalking their way through interesting experiments. And I always say that the only way to get things done in a Byzantine organization like Cambridge is to align everybody's self-interest. So what is it that turns people like me on? It's obviously not making money, otherwise I'd buy a suit. Okay. Okay, yeah. Actually, I do have one, and I will wear it tonight, I promise. No, it's the fact that I can wake up every morning and at least have a chance of finding out something that nobody's found out before, often something that nobody even thought was worth finding out before. Now, let me give you an example of some of the things that we don't really understand, and yet we still go ahead blithely, happily, and effectively making drugs against the diseases that are caused by these things. My specialty is cancer. I spend a lot of time, I'm on a oncology advisory board for AstraZeneca and for Genentech as well, and I'm involved in clinical trials because everybody who funds cancer research nowadays, and I'm funded by Cancer Research UK and Stand Up to Cancer, which is an amazing American invention where the women, and yes, they are women who run Hollywood, have decided to leverage Hollywood in order to get money to fund cancer research. And you go over there, and I've lived half my life in the US, so I don't find this strange anymore. But I spend most of my time on my feet going, yay! And then there's a reflex, because I'm actually a Brit, and my toes curl with embarrassment. Okay. On the other hand, it's very, very effective. And so I've now, for the first time in my life, heavily involved in clinical trials. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, I administer a large charitable fund that's siphoned through Cambridge for various Kafkaesque reasons that would make the pharmaceutical industry look simple and logical in comparison. But nonetheless, I'm funneling that money through down to clinical trials that are taking place at QMUL in London, Barts in London, and also at the Translational Genetics Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. So I have to listen to people planning drug trials. And the truth is, I understand about one word in 3, and I understand one concept in 10, because it's an entirely different type of, and I'll call it an art form, from what it is that I have to do, which is come up with logical, inventive, creative explanations for tiny little things that I see in my lab. You know, trying to administer these huge, great enterprises where you're literally persuading industry to give you drugs based on some often intriguing, I wouldn't call it interesting, intriguing data that it might do something for some cancer patient somewhere. And then you're essentially finding ways of pumping these drugs in intriguing combinations. I'm often phoned up, for example, and said, look, we got this drug that's an immune blockade inhibitor. What would you use it with? And I go, well, what is it you want? Okay, and they say, well, we want to make cancer patients better. So I say, okay, well, then you could try, you've got 15 different flavors of napalm, okay? Because the classical way of dealing with cancer was you just cut it out, blast it out, or burn it out with various types of poison. In the curious belief, which is even more curiously often true, that the cancer will die before the patient dies. Now, do we understand that? No, we don't really understand that at all. There's lots of explanations, it's hand-waving and everything. In fact, I go so far as to say we don't understand why any of our anti-cancer drugs actually kill cancer cells. Because you think about it, and this is something I spend a lot of my time thinking about. You can imagine what a sad life I have. Okay. Okay. So the mutations that drive cancers are mutations that drive sustained proliferation, right? That's why it's a cancer, it's growing. There's no obvious reason why it is that if you blocked that mutation, the cancer cell would die. In fact, every prediction you would make would be it would just stop and stay there. But in almost every case, the cancer cells die. Do we know why? It's pretty fundamental, right? All these amazing targeted therapies, that is true, don't cure people yet, but can often give them 5 or 6 years of extended survival, usually without terrible side effects, which may be long enough for them to see their child go to college or get married. And who knows, the rate things are happening at the moment. 5 years, more drugs available within 5 years. We've already heard about multiple myeloma, Velcade alone, not that good. But you combine it with a thalidomide derivative, and then you combine it with a bone marrow transplant, and we can put people in remission for 15 years. In 15 years, I have no idea what it's going to look like. So yeah, this is the best of times, but intellectually, it's still pretty primitive and the worst of times. We don't understand nearly enough about what we're actually doing. And the other problem with targeted therapies in cancer, of course, is you think about it, what do you want to do? Do you want to actually really inhibit the Abl kinase or the Src kinase or EGFR? No, you don't, because then you inhibit it everywhere. Actually, what you want to do is to restore the normal regulation of that mutated protein. You don't want to wipe it out, but we don't know how to do that. So all we can do is knock it down, knock it out, and once again rely on this remarkable observation that cancer cells are intrinsically more susceptible to being mucked around with than our normal cells. Now, where are we going to get the answers for more efficient medicine of the future? We're going to get a lot of it from the practice of trying out drugs in patients, because we don't know nearly enough about it. Quite honestly, a lot of it is mix and match and see what happens. And is that a great way of doing science? I'll put it to you, for 500 years, it was the only way of doing science. Science is experimental. It's not sitting on your thumbs and thinking about why something should or should not work. On the other hand, do we as human beings reserve the right to try and work out why these unusual combinations of drugs work better than either drug alone? And the answer is yes, and that's why we have universities. To drive universities, you have to give people interesting problems, not a lot of money, but interesting problems, and you have to get them to feed those problems through to our colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, and that's what's going to make a difference for humanity.
Thank you, Gerard. And last but not least, our final panellist today is Urvashi Prasad. Urvashi is the Director of Operation ASHA, a not-for-profit organisation. Urvashi's work is involved in current and future health challenges posed by infectious diseases. She's doing work alongside these challenges to be met in the developing world and looking at solutions that biotechnology may be able to offer in these two gap areas. Urvashi.
Thank you very much. Several years ago, I did my MPhil from Cambridge, so it's wonderful to be back here. Most of my experience has been in the public health space in developing countries, so that's what I'm going to focus on today. Since I'm going to talk about challenges, it can get quite depressing to think of all the challenges, so I think at the outset I'll say that we've made a lot of progress. When it comes to infectious diseases in developing countries, whether it's polio, whether it's measles, I think we've really come a very long way on a lot of fronts. But obviously several key challenges remain for us, and I'll just talk through a few of them and also bring in where biotechnology can obviously play a role. The first area where we do face a lot of challenges on screening for infectious diseases. And when I say screening, I mean a level even before diagnosis, which is really training community health workers to go out into communities, whether it's villages, whether it's informal settlements in urban areas, and screen people for even initial symptoms that they often show. I work a lot in tuberculosis, and this is an area where a lot of this needs to be done because by the time people present to the health system, often they present when their disease is already quite advanced or it's already become quite difficult to treat, and then they are really a fit case for secondary or tertiary care. So they've really gone beyond the primary care level altogether, which is a big challenge because when we're talking of, say, India, we're talking of very, very large numbers, and we simply will not have enough hospitals or the ideal doctor-to-patient ratio in the foreseeable future. So we do need to start looking at these patients and picking them up more at a primary care level or at an early stage, rather than kind of waiting for them to reach a very advanced stage. And then, even with the best medicines in the world sometimes, and with all the doctors, it's often very difficult to treat them. So I think screening is one big area where we need a lot more tools and technologies and training of community health workers to screen people. What this obviously also helps to do is to reduce the transmission in communities, something like TB. If we can pick it up earlier, we're also reducing the potential of transmitting it to other people in the community. So that's the first area. The second one is around diagnosis. And here again, I think looking at diagnostics which we can use easily in primary care settings, which are obviously affordable, but also the ease of use of those diagnostics. And an example I'll give here is of Gene Expert, which has recently been rolled out in India and a lot of other countries as well for tuberculosis. It's a molecular diagnostic, and it definitely is more efficient. It gives results much faster than a traditional sputum culture, which can take several weeks, and patients are often started on presumptive treatment for TB because doctors don't want to wait that long for the confirmed result to come, which in itself has consequences, as you can imagine. So Gene Expert has a lot of benefits, but I think some of the challenges we're still grappling with are the costs. When we're trying to roll it out in a large country like India, not every place can really afford it, so it's still limited to a pilot stage. The second issue is also the fragility of the test or the conditions in which it can operate. So if the equipment is very sensitive or it's heat sensitive or it needs a stable electricity connection, again, it really limits our ability to make sure that people who really need it are getting it because we simply cannot roll it out in those settings. So diagnosis is really the second area where I think we do have a lot of challenge, and there are a lot of new tools that we can develop, keeping in mind the costs as well as the ease of use and administration in different settings. On the treatment side, I think there are a couple of major issues that we are facing. One is that the treatment regimens for a lot of diseases, I mean, obviously we've got a lot of combination therapies, we've got a lot of new drugs. But if I just look at tuberculosis, we now have a lot of drug-resistant strains as well emerging. So we have multi-drug resistant, extremely drug resistant, and really at every level, the treatment regimens are more and more complex, more and more difficult. Some of them do have very unpleasant side effects. And so when we're thinking about just trying to get people to comply with those treatment regimens, it is a big problem. It was an interesting statement that somebody made, that if you stack up all the pills that a multi-drug resistant patient needs to take over 24 months or even longer, you could come up with an 18-story building. So if we just think about, trying to get that patient to comply with that treatment, it's a big problem for us, when we're working in the real world settings. The second is that we see a lot of comorbidity. So I am talking of infectious diseases, but we see a lot of patients in which we are finding not just TB HIV, but we're finding TB diabetes, or we're finding TB hypertension. And I think that also creates complications for when we're thinking about the therapies, the drug sort of interactions. And I think that's an important area as well to just keep in mind for the future, because non-communicable diseases in developing countries are a growing and a very significant burden. So we still have the infectious diseases, but now we also have the NCDs to deal with. So it's becoming more complicated. The final area that I would talk about, and often this is not seen as a healthcare challenge per se, but more of a social issue, but I think anybody working in healthcare needs to really focus on this, is awareness and social stigma. A lot of infectious diseases in particular, whether it's TB, whether it's HIV, they are associated with a lot of social stigma. Even when there are effective treatments and cures available, a lot of time people don't even want to go and seek those treatments simply because they don't want anyone to know that they have TB. And people lose jobs because of this. There are people who are thrown out of their families. There are children who have to drop out of school. So the consequences of the stigma are huge. And TB is not a new disease. It's been there for the longest time. And we've developed new drugs and we've developed new diagnostics, but we haven't been able to break the stigma. So I think that is something that for any of us working in healthcare is really a big issue. And not only because of the fact that it affects the lives of the patients, but also because it affects our notification, our reporting. A lot of times people do not even want to report that they have these conditions. So I think it has really huge consequences from a healthcare perspective. So I think those are really the major challenges, when we talk of developing countries.
Thank you. Thanks, Urvashi. Well, I'm going to join the panel now and start with a few questions from the chair. I know we have a very inquisitive audience today, so they'll follow up, I'm sure. But I've got 3 questions. I was thinking of taking it in turns. I'll try one of mine, then one of yours, and then one of mine, and see how we go. So my first question, just thinking about this future health care issue, the future of health by 2050, what type of conditions do we expect to see? We've talked a bit about diabetes, we've talked about cancer, we've talked about HIV and TB. But given that our societies in developed worlds at least are aging and potentially therefore having to work longer, some of the chronic conditions that we might be thinking about in terms of applying your techniques and expertise to solving those solutions that are storing up for us. Who would like to answer that question first?
Well, I certainly don't have a crystal ball on this, but this has been a topic that we all been thinking about a lot. Obviously, there is a fast development in the technology space where it enable us to do a early diagnosis and also medical community engaging the general public or the patient populations, and then from the community care system in order to identify those potential issues and better education, live a healthy lifestyle. Hopefully by then we get away from hypertension, diabetes, or metabolic syndrome. But that's just, I think, in one part, you may be able to identify the issue earlier, or even identify the cancer earlier. And then you apply for the prevention. But on the other side, there's the big hurdle between what we try to set up this as a perfect world versus, you know, the current socio-economical system that drives the interesting party to work together. I think now I live in the US and now live in China. Now I hear a little bit more about you know, the UK. The healthcare system need to be worked together to address the common care issue. That's where I think, from many aspects, the technology now is getting available, and then I think even will be further advanced over the next 10 years to address the diagnosis and to address the care, the prevention. It's the political economical system is going to allow us to work together coherently and then put the human health as the first priority in their national policy or in the regulatory environment setting. That's where I think nowadays I'm very pleased in the last year or two see this happening in China, see the top leaders at national level start to talk about this, think about this, and developing strategy on this. But again, whether this can be continued, move on, be able to embrace the technology and get to address the human health as the first priority of the nation, that still needs to be
That was
further
actually going to be my second question. How can everybody involved in the health supply chain really work more collaboratively? But just coming back to this question of potential future health challenges by 2050, I'd love to hear from the other panel members.
I mean, I think autoimmune disease for sure, because we're changing our diet, we're changing our environments all around the world. So, you know, things like arthritis and multiple sclerosis and various stomach complaints would only get worse because we don't understand the causes. But then I think one of the biggest ones is antibiotics. We absolutely need more. I know in our labs we have many of the common bacteria that we've known for years are resistant to every single antibiotic there is out there, or just need one change. And it doesn't have to be plasmid transferred. It can be from just one nucleotide change in their genomes, and they're resistant to everything. So, and you know, Jim O'Neill review has already calculated it's going to cost the world $250 trillion by 2050. So that's really probably the biggest.
Well, in terms of diseases associated with age, I'm very goal-driven, so I ask myself, well, what is it that people actually want? They're not going to live forever, and it seems to me that most people I've ever spoken to say they want their lives to go like that, not like that. So the issue is, what do you do about it? So what do you do to alleviate symptoms, where the symptoms are causing pain or distress to people? They may not get all their mobility back, but at least they're not in pain anymore. In terms of cancer, do we need to cure the disease, or do we need to contain the disease? Well, clearly we need to contain the disease. The reason we can't, incidentally, the reason we don't cure cancers is not because the drugs don't work or stop working, it's because the cancers evolve around the drug. So we're hitting a moving target, which makes it a peculiar disease to try and hit. But I think that what we should be aiming for is not to extend human life necessarily, though, of course, the statistic, I think, is every day you wake up to a day that's 29 hours long, because life expectancy is still going up everywhere in the world that quickly. But I don't think we should really be aiming for increasing life expectancy, but obviously life quality, and thinking about how to do that. And that doesn't need necessarily to mean that you have to cure everything. You can enhance the quality of life in non-pharmacological ways as well, that nonetheless still make life very special, very important, and very gratifying. And I think we need a more holistic view of it.
And that would still help people to carry on working longer if they need to finance that.
They're going to need to carry on working, yeah.
And
I mean,
Urvashi, a final word from you?
Yeah, I think in terms of thinking of aging populations, I think definitely some of the chronic diseases, even in the developing countries, whether it's cardiovascular, cancer, or actually we have a lot of mental health. Again, it doesn't get talked about that often, but it's a huge burden and I think underestimated. So I think that's definitely increasing. But I think, as I said, we've still not really tackled that infectious disease bit as well. So I think there will be quite some time when we'll be facing both as we are today. And hopefully we'll get a better grasp of at least some of the infectious disease issues like TB. But I think the emergence of the drug-resistant strains is a big threat to that. So I think there will be a period when we talk of the future when we are definitely grappling with both at quite a high intensity. But I think the chronic conditions are definitely going up significantly in the developing world.
Thank you. So questions from the floor. There's lots of hands gone up all of a sudden. I know the first two rows are speakers, so I'm going to give the audience a challenge, the chance first. Yes, yourself there in the third row. Can we have a mic over here? Oh, sorry. Well, we'll take that question first as a mic's been given out, and we'll have one down here afterwards.
This one?
Thank you. Yes, you first, sir, at the back.
Okay. Hello, my question is for Urvashi. So my question is, I'm from Nigeria, and in Nigeria, one of the problems we have, just like other developing countries, is infectious diseases. We have many of them, tuberculosis and the rest of them. And it's unfortunate that, it's okay, but it's still unfortunate that most of the efforts that you are seeing in terms of infectious disease research is coming from the UK and some of these developed countries. How do you think that we can stimulate infectious disease research in developing countries like in Africa, where this problem is actually more than European and American countries?
So if I understood, you're asking how we can develop more new technologies in developing countries, or okay, as opposed to the. Yeah, I think, I mean, there's definitely, I think a funding issue is a big issue there as well. I think, there is a lot more resources also that need to be put into on the research side. But I think a big challenge with just getting a hold of these, sort of getting or sort of reducing the burden is sometimes not having the drugs or not having, the treatments available, but as I was, I think, alluding to earlier, just getting them to reach people in all kinds of settings, because I think, as you said, if something is coming which has been developed in a different setting, it often needs to be contextualized, and there's a lot of other elements that come into the mix. So sometimes we found, even vaccines or drugs, which there's a lot of evidence based, they're very effective, but just getting them to people in all kinds of settings, in very, very diverse settings, that's a problem, and I think a lot of collaboration is needed there between those who are doing the innovation, the civil society, the governments, because I think still a lot of times stakeholders sometimes work in silos, and at least I've seen that even in public health, that a lot of time the government is kind of doing its own thing, civil society is doing its own thing, and so sometimes even a very effective treatment or intervention doesn't actually reach people. So definitely the innovation is needed, and I agree, and I think the funding, there's a human resource issue there, there's an infrastructure issue, we do have a lot of issues with our laboratories, we have a lot of problems even for some of the basic research. So I think infrastructure, resources, people is definitely there, but I think even for existing interventions, we need more innovation in the actual delivery models. So that we're actually reaching the millions of people that we need to reach, and we're not talking of small numbers, unfortunately. So.
Any more?
I think it's a great question, and there's a massive opportunity for the world there. I know our CSO, John Wayne, was funded by the Wellcome Trust to work in Nigeria and Vietnam and various other places in the developing world, and learnt an enormous amount in terms of infectious disease progression and therapy, actually. And you're right, it was difficult to set up labs, and you almost had to go up with a sort of build your own labs in these places. But there's a massive opportunity to learn from countries like Nigeria, absolutely.
Thank you. So there was a question in the third row.
My name is Jeff Teo, and I'm from the University of Virginia. And we talked a lot about this morning about how biotech is reaching new frontiers that we've never dealt with before. We don't know how to deal with them once they actually reach the patient. So my question is what are you doing now, and perhaps more importantly, what can we do to help keep policy and regulation up to date with the innovations of the future?
Who would like to take that one first?
I can try initially. I mean, we're trying something with the UK government at the moment, whereby what we're trying to do, we're developing antibiotics, and what we want is, you don't want to give antibiotics. Ideally, you don't want to give them because if you give them, there's a chance that you can develop antibiotic resistance, and that drug will no longer be useful. But you want them. A great analogy coined by a guy called John Rex from AstraZeneca was that if you have a fire extinguisher in your room, you don't want to use it, but you have that comfort that it's there. So we want a pricing model that actually gives us some money for developing the medicine, but it can still be not used. So currently we're talking with the UK government, and we basically go down to Parliament and we lobby, and we say, well, look, you know, if there's some sort of insurance policy here whereby we can have this drug available and we will give it to you, but you just give us a certain amount of money per year, then that'll work. That'll be financially viable. So we're having to think outside the box in terms of new models that give every sort of stakeholder some benefit in the game. So that's one example.
You know, one thing I want to add on to this, I think it's a huge opportunity for you understanding the regulatory environment, understanding the approaches in the drug development, and then it's importantly the practice, right? The practice in the drug development and distribution and quality control. Have interaction with the people in developing country like China, right? Over the last 10 years, when I serve as the president of SAPA, every year I organize a conference with Beijing and Shanghai local government, just talking about the topic we've been talking today. I think now we have a lot of people understand it from the government, and then from the first tier city, and then the second tier, third tier city need to catch up. This is from the, influencing by going there, telling them, showing them the showcase. The other part is now I think the medical community need to be engaged a lot more. We actually try to help the China physicians come out to the States and Europe, participating all the conferences and the meetings, and also all the multinational pharmaceutical try to sponsor that, and which create some issues about how your funding is actually properly used for the meeting promotion. And I'm thinking, why don't we have meeting like this in Shanghai and in Beijing that those you can benefit a lot of more healthcare participants and physicians and policymakers. And then actually they like to talk to you. We've been talking to them and they learn a lot. And now I'm part of the game players, and then I speak less for the regulatory part, but more from our practice and influence them. But a lot of common sense that we've been talking about today in this conference can be very well used and then distributed and then contribute to the development, at least from my point of view, in a big country in China. So thanks.
There was a question at the back there, just by the camera. Yeah.
Hi, Urvashi, Prasad. I have a question for you about tuberculosis. So is there any point of care diagnostics that is developing domestically in India? Because you mentioned that the price of expert is high. So I'm wondering whether there's any local innovation happening in India, not just to help, not just to reduce the price and, to help Indian people. Because I think tuberculosis is a big problem for me as an international student coming to this country. Myself has to perform an X-ray to get a visa to actually sitting down here. So really it's a big problem because the tuberculosis incidence in London is increasing because globalization issues. So I'm wondering, is any of this sort of local innovation that is happening can be considered as reverse innovation, helping the Indian nation, but also other countries? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there is a lot of innovation, but I think, it's obviously to reach a stage where it's being rolled out. There's a process, but there are a lot of innovations that have come up, and actually there's a lot of funding that we've seen in the last, even 2 years from a lot of development agencies, from USAID, from a lot of others, to sort of test out innovations that have come up from the country itself. So, not just bringing in something from the outside. I don't know of anyone which has reached a very advanced stage at this point, but I do know that several are being tested, piloted, and a lot of different agencies are taking interest in that. But I think, as you said, with the drug resistance, I think it's becoming a global issue. It's not just with the people traveling all across the world. It's not just limited to developing countries or to India or any other high burden country. It's a threat to the entire world. So I think that is something that I guess research would perhaps happen everywhere. We recently had an issue with a extremely drug resistant strain. Somebody traveled to the US, and there was a lot of things that then happened as a result of that, and a lot of people had to be kind of screened, and so I think it's a threat really globally now, especially with the emergence of drug resistance. But there are a lot of innovations that are coming up in India, but they need the funding, they need the infrastructure and everything to kind of see them through to the final stage. So yeah, I think that is happening for sure. Yeah.
I can just say it's so important that this happens, because human beings, what they are, will, instead of putting money into trying to find ways to cure tuberculosis, decide instead to just keep the immigrants out. So we're all in this together, right? And we need to make sure that we live in a world that we want to live in, that isn't run by the Donald Trumps of the universe.
Yeah.
May I put the next question to the panel?
There's another one there.
Hi, I'm Yogesh. I'm an undergraduate from India. So I live in a state where even the water is not good. It is contaminated with arsenic. And we all know that the research is done in the Western world, and they have found a cure how to remove arsenic and bring it down to the safety consumable levels. But that research has not reached out to my village, my town. So if someone in the world has done a research which can solve problem of thousands and millions of people, and that is not being translated because of issues of funding, then how should we at this global stage discuss that problem? What's the solution of that?
That's the question.
That wasn't the question I had in mind.
That's your question, right?
I'm sure Donald Trump isn't the answer to that one either. Would any of the panel like to come in on that, or is that one for the coffee break, perhaps?
Okay. So I think in general, the scientific innovation and then the investment into the medicine or effective treatment shall be at the end reach to the hand of needs, right? That's the whole idea. And then there's the economic factors, there's political economic factors need to be factored in. That's where for those contagious diseases, especially under the widespread situation, there is a funding mechanism into that. And also there is the pharmaceutical company who donates the type of medicine into the region. And I remember when I was at Roche, when China has this avian flu came in, and Roche basically put their entire country drug reserve, the Tamiflu, to the central government. And then we didn't sell 1 penny on that year on Tamiflu by ourselves. We gave all the supplies to the government. Then those are the things that when pandemic happens, and then you do need to contribute to. And then to the other part, we're all talking about economics, and at the end of the day, the investment need to be returned, and then need to be further invest, and then that healthy circle for creating and honor the intellectual property shall also be major part of this whole game.
Remember what the patent system's for. It's basically a contract between yourself, the patent person that's got the invention, and the state that you're patenting that invention in, to say, well, you know, if I let you have this after an expiry date, let me have some exclusivity. So something like taking arsenic out of water, I mean, that patent's gone many years ago. So it's a repository of information, of research that's out there that's free for everyone to use. It's free, available. So it's up to people in the countries to just use it, you know, exploit that resource, because it's huge.
Yeah, I think I'll just very quickly add to that it is, I mean, a political will, I think, is a big issue as well. For, you know, a lot of technologies or interventions, as I was saying, are available, and you know, not everything is that we need to create new things. I mean, we always need to innovate, but I think a lot of things that are available, a lot of times the political will is not as much as it should be, and it's not as much of a priority, and there are 10 other things that are, you know, coming before that. The second is an empowered, you know, people. I think that is really important. I mean, if more and more people start demanding that, you know, it's our right to have this arsenic-free water, or, you know, we have to have sanitation, or we have to have basic nutrition, it will create that pressure as well on the you know, the political class. So I think a lot of times people are not even demanding some of these things enough. Sometimes it's an awareness issue. Sometimes it's, you know, people just don't know what to sort of say or what to do in these situations. So I think it's a mix of all of that. I mean, funding is definitely there, but I think it's also a will issue and a demand issue, really.
Thank you. Some good advice there from our panel. Just bringing the session back a little bit to the future health challenges by 2050. We heard actually a question from the audience in Jeremy Levin's presentation around, could we find another word for the patient? My final question of the day is about the impact of consumerism and the fact that actually, given the nature of digital health and telecare, we have also almost disintermediated part of the healthcare supply chain. I was interested to understand the panel's perception by 2050 of what that might do to the whole sector itself, and your perceptions of the key challenges that we may need to navigate now, especially as these people set out on their journey navigating that existing framework. It's a legacy, but we're moving on. So the consumer changes to the healthcare sector.
If you look at a lotion that you put on your skin or something you wash your hair with, it contains a load of ingredients that you don't know who supplied them. And usually, you know, the company that's made them, L'Oreal or whoever they are, have sourced these ingredients from a number of different places. Companies, massive companies that are making huge profits that you've never heard of. Now, the future of healthcare could be pharmaceutical companies as the ingredient suppliers, so the suppliers of the therapeutics that we take. And I think, I wasn't here this morning, but I think you heard about you know, Facebook and Google and other companies in that sort of IT space which are currently moving into the healthcare sector, and the Amazons of this world that could be the suppliers of healthcare. We need someone brave, someone with vision, someone who's going to champion a new type of healthcare that can be more driven by consumers. And I don't yet see pharma doing that. So if pharma don't do that, they're going to be the ingredient suppliers, I think.
Just from the, you know, play the devil of advocates and then talking about from the other perspective. In China, we have this Alibaba, right? Anybody don't know Alibaba? Okay. If you don't know, you're out. They basically have, in China, over 400 million customers. And then probably worldwide now they are expanding their capability. They say, in 30 years, that's Jack Ma said, right? In 30 years, we don't need physician. Alibaba will be the ultimate, right, healthcare provider. One question I always have in my mind is saying, patient-physician relationship maintained as the core of the whole healthcare domain. Without that core, we don't have a healthcare system. Right? If Alibaba was trained as a physician and then all his sales personnel trained from medical school, understand disease, know how to do the prescription, fine. Otherwise, physician and patient interaction is a contract. It's a life contract. I talk to many physicians. They are very passionate to their patients. They are very passionate to know how they've been doing and where their disease is progressing and then how they can help them. And then physician and the patient listen to the physician advice and then seeking for a better way of changing their life and health condition. I think that's before we solve this core interaction and find out what's the best way we can help them. Physician and our patient work together to address health issue. We, as a healthcare provider, being a pharmaceutical company, a traditional one, like Roche, Pfizer, manufacturing 10, 20,000 compound, or the future pharmaceutical company, an integrated care company. They provide cares. They provide cares, prevention, diagnosis, helping the physicians to build a strong interaction and then bring the needs at first time. The right physician, right treatment to the patients. That's where I think the future telecommunication will help us.
Time for a very quick comment from our final two panelists, if
Well,
you'd
I
like
just
to offer
say,
any.
I think the problem is there's lots of things going on here. I'm in all for empowerment of the patient. But if people think that years of training in medicine can somehow be replaced by some Google check sheet, you must be out of your mind. Even if the patient were completely on top of things, I'm sure I don't need to remind everybody that when you're ill or you're close to somebody who's ill, they are absolutely terrified. And they are not in a position to go round looking for this, that, and the other. That's something that they can do when they're checked out and they're feeling a little bit better. And often what people understand or what they get from the internet is not particularly useful. And that doesn't mean to say that you've got some global physician conspiracy. It just means that it's very complicated. Making a differential diagnosis is an incredibly complicated thing to do, and you can't just do it by pressing buttons and ticking boxes.
But isn't it beyond the skill of a physician now to understand all of the current medicines? It is. I mean, physicians come out of medicine school now, and the statistic is something like only 14% of them can prescribe correctly. It's an awful figure. My doctor, I go in to see him, and he takes out his Google. Expert systems are better at diagnosing diseases than doctors now.
For most diseases, most of the time that's true, okay? And actually you can do it with a check sheet. It's just the question is, are you sure you've got one of those really obvious cases? Or maybe you don't have. I mean, I know somebody who only 2 weeks ago went into hospital, query appendicitis, right? And then we went through Crohn's disease, and then we went through sort of goblet cell tumors, and then we went through everything else. It's still not clear what's going on. So, you know, these things can be very complicated. The person concerned is very scared, and everyone has to understand that nobody has all the answers, and you can't fix everything immediately. And just because you can't, it doesn't mean to say that somebody's to blame.
A final comment from Urvashi?
Yeah, so I think most of it has been said, but I think, again, just from the developing country perspective, I would say that there's quite an inequity in information, you know, right now. So yes, there is a growing kind of class of people who have access to all the information, and there's internet, and it's all on the mobile phones, and I think, as he said, there's a lot of risks to that as well. But I think there are some people who just don't have very much information at all. So I think hopefully somewhere going forward, we'll be able to address that inequity, because I think that creates a lot of tension even in the physician-patient relationship.
Thank you very much. And I am sorry, we are out of time. I know there's plenty of hands going up in the audience out there. It's obviously touched on a relevant topic. But may I say a big thank you to our panelists for their expert advice.
most pressing obstacles in funding in 2016?
Yep, so obviously it depends on the geography that you're talking about. From a global perspective, we have what in the world of finance we call a risk-off environment, where investors are not as willing to take equity risk, and that applies to equity risk. So for example, large pharmaceuticals industry, the Roches and Novartises and Lilly's and Merck's of this world, who normally are supposed to be defensive sectors because they have really high cash flows and people still need medicines even when the economy is not going very well, are now trading at the lowest valuation of any of the industrial sectors. When I say industrial, that's just simply to take out the financial groups because they don't trade on price earnings ratios. So the PE multiple, which is the easiest way you value a company, for the large pharma industry is the lowest amongst these companies. So that tells you that we are in a world where some things spook people about not just drug development, but generally risk-viewed investments. And pharma, and therefore certainly biotech fits that. Now, on the biotech world, the NASDAQ Biotech Index, which is probably the best proxy for how appetite is for biotech investments, is down 33% from its peak, which was on the 20th of July 2015. And that's also natural because that peak of 4,165 or something like that compares to just over 700 or 650 a few years back. So this has been a phenomenal return where people are looking in their profits. What's driving all this is uncertainty about China, which is the engine of growth for the globe, globally. Uncertainty about the free cash that basically a lot of the central banks have been giving the market in terms of quantitative easing. Is that coming to an end? Certainly in the US it is. So the moment that the cost of money goes up, then you suddenly are in a world where people are more, they think through their investments a bit more and ask for higher returns. Is it because of what's going on in the emerging markets and commodities? Probably, partly. So there are many factors that have led to this risk-off view, and that's impacted investments in 2016. So far this quarter, or Q1, we had 9 IPOs. That compares to over 50 in 2015 and over 70 in 2014, and I'm talking just the USA. So it's all feeding together to make it a very tough investment environment, funding environment for biotechs.
Are the research and innovation high risk and long-term return companies still attractive to investors?
Well, yes. So, but in any world, in any investment, there's always cycles. People come into it, people leave it. Let's look at technology. Up until 9 months ago, talking about unicorns, companies were getting $7 billion, $10 billion, $30 billion investment valuations. And of course now suddenly everybody is thinking, were they realistic? And everyone's kind of reanalyzing, assessing those investments they made or thinking about the valuations they were getting. Were we being crazy doing that? So you get cycles. The reality is, our world without innovation will be stagnant. It doesn't go anywhere. We need new drugs. We need new technologies. And that's a given. Moore's law in technology. It's a given. So it's like water. It will find its way. It will find its path, one way or another. My personal view is, in this moment where we're in the risk-off mode, actually is probably the best time to be investing, because you find things at better valuations. So your chances are that if one of them works, you can get a much higher return than you would have done if you were investing at 4 times the valuation it was before. It is today. So I think investors who are sufficiently savvy and are not just following momentum are absolutely there. But a lot of the momentum followers kind of evaporate during these times, which is natural. So you get back down to the hardcore investors, and there's a lot of interest in